So, the last part of the 20th century, the Episcopal Church, especially in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, absolutely nothing but turmoil on many fronts, multiple fronts. Needless to say, in the 60s, it begins with the Vietnam War. And initially, in '66, the Episcopal Church distributed a pamphlet entitled Choosing Your Draft Classification. Well, you can imagine that that did not go over all that well in many corners of the Episcopal Church. Clergy and laity disagreed with the idea of the church taking some kind of position, whatever you want to call it, with regard to the war. And so the protests in terms of letters being written, telephone calls being made, were so extensive. Now think about it. This is '66. This is not a time, it's not like today where you hit send on email and it's gone. It means you have to pick up the phone, sit on hold, wait for somebody to answer it, and the uproar was humongous. And so the Executive Council of the Episcopal Church said no more, got rid of the publication, and created a new pamphlet that said, the majority of Episcopal young men choose active duty. Who knows whether that was true? It was merely meant to countermand the previous one. This was also the time of the God is dead movement. So, in the middle of war, we also have within the life of the church the whole belief in some quarters that this was the time to reject the traditional ways of thinking of God. Now, it's sort of interesting, I think, that when there is, if you think back to all the things we've talked about this winter and spring, when there is upheaval in the world, there tends to be some need on the part of some people for further theological clarification. What do I mean? Well, the whole Bishop Colenso situation in 1867, which led to the first Lambeth Conference. Well, you say, yeah, but the Civil War was here. But Britain was fighting the Crimean War and fighting wars in South Africa. So all of a sudden, in the midst of turmoil, we have a tendency to want to sort out, or think we want to sort out, what we think theologically. So, the God is dead movement was not just a US thing. It was also in the UK, in Europe, and theologians were really seriously saying that in this day and age, we're post-God, for lack of a better phrase. This was also a time in the United States when one particular bishop, a man named James Pike, who was the Bishop of California, published a book called Time for Christian Candor. And he declared in his book that the doctrine of the Trinity was excess baggage for Christians. Now, Pike, you might recall from about 2 weeks ago, right after World War II, when television was in its infancy, Pike had a television program about religion that was being followed, at least in the New York City market, which is where he was at that point in time. And it was straight Christian doctrine. But by the mid-60s, he was now the Bishop of California, and now he had a totally different take on things. Among other things was that Pike loved being a bishop. And unfortunately, he reveled in the attention that the episcopacy brought into his life. He also loved the attention that his book generated while people debated back and forth about the doctrine of the Trinity. He saw himself as a spokesman to a troubled and alienated country in the mid-60s. But For others in the church, he was just a nuisance and was a symbol for many of what was wrong with the Episcopal Church in the mid-60s. It did not help that Jim Pike's personal life gave cause for people to talk. He, at that point in time, had 2 divorces and was on his 3rd wife. He suffered from alcoholism, and he engaged in seances with his dead son using spiritualists and Ouija boards. So this did not help his posture that the Trinity was excess baggage, and didn't help him to gain any traction along that line. What it did do is cause the House of Bishops to issue a report critical of him. This didn't change anything in Jim Pike's life, and several bishops within the House of Bishops decided to take definitive action, and they formed a group called the Committee of Bishops to Defend the Faith. They prepared presentment charges against Pike. There were 5 charges against him, but the 12 bishops that formed this committee couldn't all agree whether they were all going to sign it. The 5 charges, which I failed to mention a minute ago: incorrect teaching on the Trinity, incorrect teaching on the Holy Spirit, incorrect teaching on the centrality of Christ for salvation, incorrect teaching on the Incarnation and the Atonement, and incorrect teaching on the Chicago Quadrilateral. We talked about that way back, probably in March, and they were the 4 points that came out of 1888 that were going to be the foundation for trying to bring all Protestant denominations under one roof.
So he's guilty of improperly teaching
Everything.
everything.
Right. He's basically improperly teaching all parts of the Christian faith. Okay? So, and of course the foundation for all of this was his book, the one that he was busy touting and pushing and all. Well, because all these bishops that formed this committee didn't sign the presentment, the charges didn't go through. What it did happen at the House of Bishops is he was censured. And the vote was 103 to 36 of the bishops who were present. So, I mean, it was pretty overwhelming.
So what is censure?
Censure means, well, it's a document, in essence, that says, we don't agree with your teaching, you are in error, you have, you're twisting the faith to the faithful. It would say various things like that. But it's just a statement. Presentment charges could result in you being stripped of your ordained, not only your episcopacy, but your ordained ministry. Okay? A censure, it's like in the military, if you do something wrong and they put a report in your file. Okay, the report goes with you, but it simply says that Corporal Dixie was away on leave without permission overnight while she was having a great time in town. Anyway, censure is like that. It's just, don't do it again, please. You're making our life difficult. So they censured him in '66, and Pike retired. Unfortunately, he continued to write in the same vein that he had been writing, and his life became increasingly eccentric in many ways. His 3rd wife, this is no judgment because I'm 10 years older than my husband, but his 3rd wife was considerably younger than Pike. And if my memory is correct, let's say 20 or more years younger than Pike. And it was, we would call it a trophy wife today. kind of syndrome, and I'm being pejorative, and I know that. But the end result of it all was they both went on a trip to the Holy Land in 1969, and for reasons that, to the best of my knowledge, were never clearly explained, they were off in the desert and they got separated. And he never made his way back, and he died of starvation, dehydration in the desert in Israel.
What happened to a lot of the people that believed him?
Well, you see, this was the beginning of when we began to see churches, congregations that would be formed around an issue that disagreed with the main line of the Episcopal Church. So, there is a congregation out in San Francisco, which is the diocesan seat for the Diocese of California. Diocese of California is merely San Francisco and the area around it, going down to like Menlo Park, Stanford, and north to Marin County. All right. There's a parish there, and I had the name 2 seconds ago, and I just watched it go right out the window. Anyway, it was founded back in this time, and part of its foundation was to be counter-cultural within the life of the Episcopal Church, and it remains that way. So it was a parish that initially completely welcomed gays and lesbians. It was always Asian, Black, Mexican, white. It was always doing something that was going to push the boundaries of the Episcopal Church. And so when people had bishops like this, you often would find a new congregation emerging that would gel, and we're going to see that in just a few minutes in other ways. We had the war. We had the excess baggage of the Trinity and the death of God going on at the same time that the Episcopal Church was trying to deal with the issue of race in this country. Beginning in the early 60s, Episcopal clergy and their spouses were frequently found on the front lines of various demonstrations and marches. Mrs. Peabody, whose first name, again, gone right out of my head, the mother of the governor of Massachusetts in the early 60s. Mrs. Peabody marched in a protest in Jacksonville, Florida. If my memory is correct, Woolworth wouldn't integrate their lunch counter. And she went down there with the wives of other clergy, as well as clergy themselves, and she was arrested for not leaving the Woolworth. And so the big headlines, this may have been 61 or 2, the big headlines were, "Mother of the Governor of Massachusetts arrested at a sit-in." She's an Episcopalian. For some Episcopalians, it was right on. For other Episcopalians, it was, oh my God, what is happening to our church? Why are we doing this? We're supposed to be the via media. We're not supposed to go too far to the right, and we're not supposed to go too far to the left. We're supposed to try to keep down the center path. In 1965, we had a new presiding bishop. His name was John Hines. He was from the Diocese of Texas. Now, you may remember last week I talked about the General Convention that was supposed to have been in Houston in '55, and they moved it to Honolulu because they were having problems with hotels and restaurants. Well, John Hines was a more liberal Texan than the restaurant and hotel owners had been, and he believed that the Episcopal Church was not doing enough along the lines of race. And so he wanted to create a special fund of $9 million whose sole purpose would be to deal with social inequities that were not already being addressed through existing channels. So in other words, the church, the Episcopal Church, was spending money in various ways, helping congregations and all, but he believed that we should be much more upfront in terms of what we were doing along the issue of race. He particularly asked a black layman to head the fund. Now, this would have been radical in the life of the Episcopal Church. When he got to New York, to 815, the headquarters of the Episcopal Church, he brought in black staff members. Again, radical move. He made grants from this special fund, which is what it was called. He made grants from the special fund, not only to existing Episcopal entities, but to entities that had no connection whatsoever with the Episcopal Church. That, of course, raised all kinds of tension and concern. He made grants to a place called Malcolm X University in North Carolina, to something in South Carolina called the Black Awareness Coordinating Committee, and to a group in New Mexico called the Alianza Federal. So you can see he's pushing money that's coming from the Episcopal Church, trying to push it more into the communities in various parts of the country. He made these grants over the objection of the local bishops. And it ended up that the publicity for the special fund was not, within the Episcopal Church, was not positive. And by '69, many people wanted the program ended. That led Hines to call for a special convention. General Convention normally meets every 3 years. So they met in '67. The next meeting would not be until '70. But in 1969, because of the uproar about the special fund and various other issues, in particular around race, Hines called for a special meeting of General Convention. He called for it on about 6 months' notice. And that special meeting happened in the summer at the one place that they found that was large enough to accommodate such a meeting, and that was the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. And you know why? Because they had dorms, and the dorms were empty.
Oh, okay.
Okay, because they weren't going to be able to get hotel rooms on short notice. They weren't going to be able to get convention space on short notice, and they had to find someplace that was willing to take them in, huge group, okay, and had the space to house them. So anyway, they met, and the big topic was the special fund. There was heated debate about it, and one black person who had been invited to the convention, not a part of the Episcopal Church, a man named Mohammed Kenyatta, was a guest on the floor, and he simply walked up to a mic when a deputy was talking, grabbed the mic from the deputy, and proceeded to demand $200,000 in reparations for the past offenses of the Episcopal Church against black Americans.
And who invited this upstart?
He was his organization was one of the recipients of money from the special fund, one of those non-Episcopal organizations. Ultimately, convention approved another grant to Kenyatta's group, but not the reparations per se.
Okay, good.
But this just raised the anxiety level. 1969, let's back up. 1968 was the year of the death of Robert Kennedy, the riots in Newark and Detroit in '68. It was the election of Richard Nixon. The war, the Vietnam War, is escalating. '68 was Tet, was My Lai, which we didn't really know about until '69. What I'm getting at is,
There's already lots of tension.
Already lots of tension in the world. And as you've probably seen over this winter and spring, the Episcopal Church historically has felt and had to work through the tension around it. Now, I'm not saying that's not true in any other denomination, but somehow or another, we're always stuck in the middle of whatever national tension.
Well, when you're trying to run the middle road,
You are going to be in the middle of all that national tension, all right? So anyway, the special program was continued in '69, but the Episcopal Church began to realize that there is no single program, whether it's diocesan, whether it's national, whether it has nothing to do with the Episcopal Church, there isn't a single program that is going to solve the issue of the racial tension that existed at the time. And so they began to realize that the special program had very few positive results, had a lot of negativity surrounding it, and it was discontinued in 1973. During this time, we did manage to elect John Burgess, whom I mentioned a few weeks ago, who was the first black diocesan bishop elected in the Episcopal Church. That was in 1962. And in 1971, we elected a Sioux Indian as the bishop suffragan in South Dakota. So a little bit of progress. And
so is the Sioux guy not a whole bishop, just
a suffragan bishop means that you are fully a bishop within the nature of your ordination, okay? But it means that you are not the diocesan, so you're not running the diocese, and you have no rights of succession.
Okay.
So for a suffragan to become the diocesan, they would have to run for bishop again. If you are a bishop coadjutor, if you are suffragan, and then if you are a bishop coadjutor, the coadjutor has the right of succession. So when he or she is elected, the diocese knows that they are electing the person that will succeed the diocesan. Now, in the last, I would say maybe the last 25 years, we have come up with another category, and that is assisting bishop. An assisting bishop is someone who has been a diocesan, a suffragan, or, well, they wouldn't be the coadjutor, diocesan or suffragan in another diocese, has retired from that ministry, and then been invited to come to XYZ diocese to assist the bishop. You tend to find assisting bishops in the really large dioceses of the church. For example, Virginia, which has 180, 190 parishes and missions, has always had some kind of assisting bishop. Frank Gray, who was the bishop of Northern Indiana up until 2000, he retired at, I want to say, somewhere around 62, 63. He's still young. And so he and his wife moved to Alexandria, where he was the assisting bishop in the Diocese of Virginia. And what he did was help the diocesan deal with parishes in the DC area. And there was another assistant whose name I can't remember, who helped that bishop deal with parishes that were out going towards Winchester, Virginia. In other words, the western part of the Diocese of Virginia. Let me just back up and say the Diocese of Virginia today is not the state. There are 3 dioceses in the state of Virginia, and the Diocese of Virginia is from Richmond north, and if you kind of take a line due west out of Richmond, it's the northern part of the state. The southern part has the Diocese of Southern Virginia and the Diocese of Southwestern Virginia, okay? But Diocese of Texas, which is Houston, is another place that has assisting bishops. LA has assisting bishops. New York has assisting bishops. But those assisting bishops have absolutely no interest whatsoever in running for coadjutor or diocesan. They've done it already. So
why haven't they gotten rid of the suffragan? Because it sounds like, oh, we're just giving you this title to make you happy. And
because the assisting bishop comes into a diocese at the invitation of the diocesan.
right.
Sometimes the diocesan knows that he or she needs help leading the diocese for whatever reason. And the help that they need is not a retired person who's happy to go out and do confirmations and the occasional ordination and an occasional parish visit. They need somebody to split up the duties of the diocese. And that is when they call for the election of a suffragan.
Okay, so it's no longer just, we're not giving you the right to do this. We just need extra people.
Right.
Okay.
We need bodies.
Okay.
And sometimes we need bodies not because we have 180, 190, 200 parishes in the diocese. Sometimes we need bodies because the diocese is so geographically huge. And what I mean by that is
It's just, you may only have 30, but they're all 150 miles apart.
right. The Diocese of West Texas, well, any of the dioceses in Texas fit this, but the Diocese of West Texas is south of Austin from the Gulf of Mexico all the way over to the Rio Grande and all the way down. Why, don't ask me why it's called West Texas, but it is the Diocese of West Texas, but it's really the southern part of the state. Well, think about what I just described. Just in your mind for a second, imagine Texas, okay? And if you're going from the Gulf of Mexico over here, not the Panhandle, but over here where El Paso is, where Texas and Mexico and the Rio Grande come together like this, that's a lot of territory in terms of getting around. So sometimes you may not have 190 parishes, but you've got so many miles that you need another body. So, early 70s.
Northwest Texas got split off. It was the whole thing. It was a west mission.
That's right. That's why it was west. That's right. Oh, but bear in mind, Dallas is its own. Fort Worth is its own.
The huge cities.
The huge cities were their own diocese, and there is now a Diocese of Northwest Texas, which is the classic panhandle of Texas that's going up over at the New Mexico state line. So yes, thank you, that's why it was west. And we have this rule in the Episcopal Church that began maybe 100 years ago, that when a diocese splits, one of the emerging two dioceses has to keep the name. Why? Because back in the late 1800s, when we began dividing dioceses, okay, we allowed historic names of dioceses to go out the window. For example, there is no Diocese of Illinois. There was a Diocese of Illinois, but there isn't one, because Chicago became its own, Springfield became its own, Peoria became its own. So when they broke up the Diocese of Illinois, nobody kept the name. Now, it is a corporate name, and you know what happens with names that have been incorporated. They live in perpetuity.
Okay.
So within the legal life of the Episcopal Church, there is a name, Diocese of Illinois.
But
But we don't have a Diocese of Illinois. And if you go back into history, obviously you'll find one until the splits came in the late 1800s. The Diocese of Wisconsin no longer exists. Because when they split that up, you got Fond du Lac, Eau Claire, Milwaukee. Diocese of Indiana does not exist. Because when they split, you got Northern Indiana and Indianapolis. So they passed this rule in General Convention in the very early 1900s that when a diocese splits, one of them has to keep the corporate name.
So that they don't have extra defunct dioceses hanging around the books that they have to check off every now and again.
Well, and it's also a legal nightmare. So what happens, it hasn't happened yet. Well, no, that's not, get ahead of myself. What happens if we're not paying attention and keeping these names legal? Then somebody comes in and wants to say, I'm part of the Episcopal Church of what's happening now in Illinois, and I'm going to be the Diocese of Illinois. In other words, not the Episcopal Church, something else. And the reason I had to stop myself is this is part of the fight in South Carolina. That the former bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of South Carolina left the Episcopal Church, taking the diocese with him into the Anglican Church of North America. And the problem is, of course, the name. The church argues that the name, the Diocese of South Carolina, belongs to the Episcopal Church. We're not going down that rabbit hole, because it's a real rabbit hole. So, 60s and 70s, we've got war, we've got God is dead, we've got civil rights issues, and then into the middle of all of that, as we touched on briefly last week, we had, I shouldn't do that, sorry. We had the whole issue of the role of women in the church. In 1970, at General Convention, we said last week that they agreed that women could be deputies, women could serve on vestries, women could be ordained to the diaconate. And that began to happen in 1971. What my familiarity with it is because of a woman who was at St. James Madison Avenue when I was there in the late 70s. Her name is Carol Anderson. She was ordained in the Diocese of New York in December of 1971 by Horace Donegan, who was then the Bishop of New York. He was 71 at the time. Mandatory retirement was 6 months away. He had ordained Carol and a woman named Julia Sibley. Julia was a hospital chaplain. Carol had been hired at St. James by the then rector, a man named John Coburn. So Horace ordained the two of them, and Carol went to work at St. James. Julia continued her work as a hospital chaplain. Horace retired in 1972, and he had been, back in the 30s and 40s, he had been the rector of St. James Madison Avenue. And so John Coburn invited him to come back and be part of the staff at St. James. So now, in 72, you had the first woman deacon in the Diocese of New York there with the very bishop who had ordained her. That relationship continued until Carol left in 79, but a few things happened along the way. In 1973, Carol and a number of women, I want to say that may have been as many as 20, went to General Convention, which I think in 73 was in Houston. No, it wasn't, it was Lexington. And they petitioned, lobbied, cajoled that women be ordained to the priesthood. And it didn't pass. There was a lot of debate on the floor, and it didn't pass. It really was, it's not even, you can't even call it close.
Was that the first time through though?
For the priesthood.
Okay.
For the priesthood. Well, a number of these women were from New York and Eastern Diocese, and they were all deacons. No, not all of them. Most of them had been ordained deacons after General Convention in 1970. And so in the summer of 74, there were 12 of them who really felt that the only way that women's ordination to the priesthood was going to happen was that matters were going to have to be taken into their own hands. And so they had 3 retired bishops who agreed to preside at the ordination. The ordination would be in Philadelphia at St. Thomas Episcopal Church, which happens to be the oldest black congregation in the Episcopal Church. It was founded in 1794, something like that. Anyway, July 28th, 29th, sometime at the end of July 1974 was the date set for this ordination. Originally, Carol was one of the 12 people. John Coburn had been elected, he had been elected the president of the House of Deputies in 1970. He was president in 73 when they could not get ordination to the priesthood passed. And John Coburn sat Carol down in his office in New York, and he basically said to her, "You are the only one of the 12 who is serving as a deacon in a parish. You have a relationship with all of the people in this parish. Whether they support ordination to the priesthood or not, you have a relationship with them." He said, "You will jeopardize all of that if you go to Philadelphia and you go through with this ordination." He also said, "I understand how difficult a decision this will be for you, but I am asking you not to go. I know you will see your friends move on and be able to preside at the Eucharist, and you won't. But I'm guaranteeing you that it will pass in 76. And I am guaranteeing you that you will be the first woman legally ordained in the Diocese of New York." Well, Carol was, at the time, Carol was, she was 30, maybe. She wasn't 30. She wasn't even 30 yet, okay? So, she's young. And so were the other women. They thought she was crazy when she said she was not going to go. That's why there were 11 women. You might say, why were there 11 women? Couldn't they have found somebody else? Well, they did. But she prayed about it, and she realized that John Coburn was dead right. She was going to sacrifice what she was doing for a political statement. So she didn't go. So then, a year later, one of those 3 bishops decides to make the point again, and he ordains 4 more women in D.C. So here's Carol. It's one thing to say, I'm not going to go in 74. Okay. And then, a year later, 4 more women have been added to the number, and I'm still a deacon. So then, fast forward, Minneapolis, September 1976. 2 big things in Minneapolis that year: prayer book reform and the ordination of women. Neither one of which was a heartwarming topic for many people in Minneapolis. you had the people who couldn't stand right to. It's dumbing down the liturgy. It's, we've lost the glory of the language. And then you also had the people who said that there was biblical warrant for not ordaining women to the priesthood. They can't do this. I mean, people would say things like, women can't be priests because they don't have the voice for it.
What?
I mean, they'd say all kinds of things. You would, I mean, and I'm sure there were things said that I can't repeat. I know there were things said that I won't repeat here, but there were also things said that, you know, the level of not making sense was escalating. And so anyway, in the House of Deputies was to vote first, and apparently, I wasn't there, but apparently the lines to get to the mic were humongous, and John Coburn kept order. And the way he kept order was it started at 2 minutes, and I believe it dropped to 90 seconds because the lines were so long. And the thing was, they pulled the sound on the mic. So you'd get to 90 seconds.
And they would pull the cord.
Because they'd cut the sound. And then John Coburn from the chair would slam the gavel and say, next. We go to mic number 2 or whatever. Okay, so we get to the end of it, and everybody's made their passionate argument, and then John Coburn said, we will have a minute of silent prayer. Now, do you have any idea how long a minute is when you might be saying, this is the worst thing we could possibly do, or you might be saying, this has got to happen? And so the silence apparently was deafening. You didn't hear none of the that always, you know, that happens in concerts. No books were dropped. No coffee mugs hit the ground. Deafening silence.
You're making me cry. I was there.
Oh my God! Well, why am I telling this?
Well, but you can tell it better. But you're making me cry. It was the most spiritual, unbelievable. I can't tell you.
Well, and those are the words that I've heard to describe what it felt like before John Coburn said, or before whoever was told to do this said, I call the question. What I've heard is you could just feel the Spirit just hovering all over this convention center. Now, I don't usually envision the Spirit in a convention center, but apparently it was there. And then they called the question, and then the voting began. And at the end of it, women's ordination had passed. That didn't make everybody happy. There were quite a few people, and we'll talk more about that next week, there were quite a few people who then began to think of, what are my next steps in terms of not being part of a church that's going to ordain women? They also passed the first reading of the prayer book, and then I got hot. They passed the first reading of the prayer book, which is the one that we currently have. It takes 2 readings, right? 2 readings at General Convention before it becomes the prayer book. 76 was the first reading. And as we saw, that's why, embarrassingly, we have books here that still say the draft proposed prayer book, because the prayer book wasn't the wording in the front of it until 1979. So 76 was an amazing convention in 1,001 ways, because the church took some major steps forward in ways that even 10 years before, I don't think anybody could have envisioned that happening, let alone happening at the same convention. Anyway, next week is our last class, and we'll say more about women's ordination, more about the prayer book, more about the continued sociological as well as theological issues, because right now, 76, we're smack dab in the middle of the, what do I want to call it? The renewal movement in the Episcopal Church, which would have yet another change on life in the church. Okay, take care. See